is Tim Leighton. I've been in the addictions field since 1985, so it's quite a long time. And interestingly, I've worked in a variety of settings, but I've always been employed by the same charity. So I went to work at Cloud's House in 1985, and I still work for Action on Addiction, which is the charity that formed out of Clouds and CDC some years ago. And this is where I work. This is the Centre for Addiction Treatment Studies, which is where our degree courses and other courses operate from. And that's in Warminster in Wiltshire. So I'm going to talk today about how people actually change when they're in a treatment program. Now, I'm not claiming that this is the only way people change. I'm not claiming that this is the only way in which people initiate their recoveries. But what I was looking at was when people are involved in an abstinence-based group community of treatment, what are the mechanisms? What exactly is going on when people are changing? And in fact, in order to introduce this, I need to talk a little bit about the evidence base, the way that evidence is collected and disseminated. Evidence-based medicine. It's quite a new thing. Archie Cochrane wrote his book, Effectiveness and Efficiency, in the 70s. And he pointed out that the first randomized controlled trial, experimental trial of a medical intervention was as recently as 1952. So the idea that medical treatments are based on experimental testing is something that's only been going on for half a century or so. And evidence-based medicine asks the does it work question. Is this an effective intervention? Does it actually work compared with something else? Does it work in the real world, which is effectiveness and so on? And it has vastly improved the efficacy of medical procedures and pharmaceutical treatments over the last 30 years. There's nothing wrong with the evidence-based medicine movement. It's the reason why when we get medical treatment today, we can be pretty sure that the treatments that we receive are properly tested. And experimental research is the right model to test most medical interventions. You should be doing randomized controlled trials in order to show that something is effective. However, that is because most of them are technologies that have a direct action on the body or the brain. But do psychosocial interventions for addictions fit the technology model? I'm going to argue that they are not technologies. They're not things that you can apply to people and they somehow work on that person and produce an outcome. They're simply not like that. How do we know that that is so? In the addiction field, there are some evidence-based interventions, for example, motivational interviewing, behavioural couples therapy, some forms of cognitive behaviour therapy, and they have more or less the same effect sizes. So if you look at the whole raft of different interventions that have been tested experimentally, some of them are a bit better than doing nothing at all. And they're about the same amount better than doing nothing at all. It's called the dodo bird verdict, because in Alice in Wonderland, Alice meets the dodo and they have a caucus race, and at the end of the race, the dodo says, all have won and all shall have prizes. So the dodo bird verdict is the idea that in psychotherapy, it really doesn't matter what your model is, the effect sizes are going to be about the same. And they're pretty modest. And they're very variable across studies. So you can find one study of a particular intervention that seems to show that it's very effective. You replicate that study and it's not effective at all. And you find that all the way across the evidence base. There is no experimental evidence for residential rehab or day rehab. Castle Craig have produced a very interesting little leaflet about the sort of evidence that Dominic McCann could find about, or the person he employed to find this evidence. But in fact, of the experimental kind, the kind that counts, the kind that gets into guidelines, there is none. I worked on the clinical guidelines group for psychosocial interventions for adult drug misuse. I was on that group, and we could find no evidence that fits the NICE guidelines to say whether rehab on a residential or a day basis was effective or not. It doesn't mean that it's not effective, it just means there's no evidence. And as a result, there is no chance that they will ever be included in clinical guidelines. If you read the NICE guideline for for adult drug misusers, psychosocial interventions. There is no mention other than a statement to say we've got no evidence about it and we need to do more research. And there is a rising critique of the evidence base. There are a number of researchers, very, very kind of influential expert researchers, that are saying our evidence base isn't making sense. It's not really telling us anything useful about what really does work in the addictions field. Jim Orford, Professor Jim Orford, who's been working in the field for 40 years plus, he worked with Griff Edwards in the Maudsley in the 70s and did some fantastically interesting research. He found out, for example, that half an hour's advice with your wife present was as effective as 3 months in a hospital rehab program. There was no difference in outcomes. It's a classic of the field. I mean, it was published in 1976, and they randomized people to half an hour's conversation with somebody who said, basically, you listen, wife, you are an alcoholic. You should not drink, and these are the reasons why you should not drink. And wife, take note, he's not to drink. And they compared that, essentially, with a 3-month playing pool in your pajamas, meeting a psychiatrist, etc. And they found that the outcomes were identical across the groups. And he published a paper which everybody should read, and it's an easy, readable paper, published in 2008, called "Asking the Right Questions in the Right Way." And fundamentally, it's an argument that we've been asking the wrong questions in the wrong way. And there is a resurgence of interest. I can't go into it because I could talk for 40 minutes just on that. But the "how does it work" question, in other words, not just does it work, how does it work? What's going on? What are the mechanisms that are producing the outcomes that we see, or failing to produce them? Because there are many people that go into rehab with all of the predictors, they should be responding, they should be just the kind of customer that's going to respond to rehab, and they leave rehab and they're using immediately. Other people look as if they're kicking and screaming into treatment, and 6 weeks later they're sailing into serene contentment forever. And I'll just give you one example of that to show you that the context is absolutely essential, and why people who claim that certain bits of evidence show you how addiction treatment works is a complete hogwash. Doctors have a lot of addiction. In America, they are treated, usually in a bog standard 12-step Minnesota model style, often residential program. Their outcomes are superb, so that 1 year later, 80% or 90% of them are still sober, or clean, or whatever it is if they're a drug problem, and they usually resume their medical practice, and they often succeed in becoming now specialists in addiction medicine, or whatever it is. Recovery produces this opportunity for them. So they do extremely well, despite the fact that when they enter treatment, they're indignant, angry, absolutely outraged at the fact they've been placed in this program. Now, black American single mothers living in Los Angeles go into the same sort of treatment program. Exactly the same. It's the same philosophy, it's the same ideology. Now, these women are desperate to change, to have a better life. Their motivation is sky high. They're also spiritually minded, they want to respond to the program, and indeed, when they are on the program, they love it, they respond to it, they do very well. 1 year later, only 10% remain abstinent. And the reason is that they do not have the resources. The doctors have rewards for recovery, they have inducements, they have sanctions, they're monitored, there's an opportunity to get your medical career back, and moreover to have a wonderful new speciality. And what the American women are going back to an environment where they have no resources, no money, they can't get to meetings, they've got childcare issues, they've got abusive partners, and as a result, they don't have the outcomes that the doctors do. Now, there was a study done in which the Afro-American women were given a Afro-American woman recovery mentor. Didn't have to be in recovery themselves, many of them were, but they were trained not to be sponsors, not to be recovery pals, but to help that woman connect with resources. The outcomes went from 10% to 35%. So the point I'm making is that the outcome of treatment is contextual. If people have the resources that they need to continue with their recovery, then they will succeed. If they do not have those resources, then they will not succeed, no matter how brilliant the treatment program is. And that's why I'm going to argue that what we need to be doing is understanding how recovery happens and making sure that treatment starts that process off and then provides people with what they need afterwards. Well, I'm sure everybody's thinking, well, we do that anyway. But we could do better with the people who have what we call low recovery capital, people who don't have those resources. Now, this is a big Cochrane review of MI that was published in 2011, published by Smedland et al., and it finishes with this statement: this is a field where there is no lack of randomized controlled trials. Perhaps it is time to move from only studying whether MI works to also studying how it works. That is, to study the mechanisms behind MI. I'm going to try and finish speaking in about half an hour, so we spend the rest of the session talking about it. And that's going to be a tall order, but I'll give it a go. But certainly I will not bore you by talking for an hour and a half. There's no question of that. I've seen that happen. I went to UCAAD one time and somebody talked for an hour and a half, and it killed off quite a lot of my brain cells. So I'm going to restrain myself from that. We're at the beginning of this research agenda. People have been doing the does it work research for the last 20 years. All strategies and methods will be necessary to enhance this knowledge base. How do these interventions actually work? Now, John Kelly and his colleagues, I think John Kelly's been here actually, and he's one of my people who's inspired me as a researcher, and he's been researching into the mechanisms of AA and has published several papers. And he's basically showing that people who get into 12-step recovery and succeed with it, it's got nothing to do with what AA philosophy or ideology or stories. The number of steps you work doesn't make any difference. It doesn't do you any harm, but it doesn't predict success either. What does predict success on a very large data set, this is thousands of people that he's looking at, if you change your social network, so change the people you hang out with. A guy called Leighton did another study that showed that if you add one abstinent friend to your social network, it doubles your chances of recovery over 1 year. So get rid of the people you used to hang around with and hang around with some new ones. That's a good idea. And increase self-efficacy. So people who learn to be confident about their ability to be sober did well. People who really believed in the idea that they could do it, that they could stay sober. Whether they're using little tips and tricks like day at a time or whatever, didn't matter, as long as you had that confidence. And for the more impaired people who had a very severe problem, low recovery capital, high severity, spiritual practices kicked in as a predictor. So people who sat down and read their books and meditated and stuff, that kicks in at the severe end as a predictor. And also people who were able to find that AA helped them reduce their negative emotional states. That again was important for people at the severe end. So there's some work going on to begin to think about how what exactly are the predictors of recovery here. But they're mediators. This is the kind of philosophy of science bit that will go on for about 5 minutes, and if you want to try and follow it, I hope it will be followable. John Kelly, like everybody else, does his research through statistical analysis. He looks at a big data set and he says, Project Match measured the stuff at baseline, 9 months, 15 months, 3 years and 5 years. And he does this thing called a time-lagged multi-mediational analysis. But it's all statistics. It's looking to see whether certain characteristics at certain time points are associated with other things at a later time point. But these are they're not really mechanisms. That's not really getting at how it works. I mean, for example, if you change your social network, that's a predictor. But what's going on? What is it? Is it role modeling? Is it people to play football in Holland Park with? Is it mentoring? Is it the fact that you feel part of something? I mean, there are so many possible explanations of the real mechanism. Pawson and Tilley wrote a book called Realistic Evaluation. Fantastic book. And they said that because they were looking at things like teaching interventions, reducing class sizes, putting up CCTV to stop crime, speed cameras, any kind of social intervention, they were saying, well, how do these things actually work? And he suggests that social programs consist of suggestions for future action. So if I go past a Gatso camera, I could have the view that, fuck them, I don't give a shit about speed limits. Or you could say, oh my God, I'm going to get points on my license. I saw a flash, and maybe a little bit of behavioural stuff happens and you actually get done and you get your 3 points. Speed cameras have been very effective at reducing speeds on British roads, but the way they work is by entering the reasoning of the people driving the cars. People start thinking about things in a different way, and one can imagine certain people not responding and not giving a shit about it and getting themselves disqualified after a bit. The point is that interventions offer subjects resources which they then accept or reject, and whether they do so depends on their characteristics and circumstances. So what you're looking at is that a treatment program offers certain things. And some people accept those resources and some people don't. And the question is, well, why do some do and why do some don't? And that's what my research has really been trying to answer. And I've taken what's called a realist view. So orthodox psychosocial research is what's called positivist. It holds that it is only possible to research observable events, and therefore it relies on statistical association to suggest causality. So most of orthodox research is looking at collecting a large number of numbers and doing some kind of statistical analysis. Most science doesn't operate that way. You don't understand how gunpowder explodes by setting up hundreds and hundreds of piles of gunpowder and then counting the number that go off. What you do is you understand the mechanism, that certain chemicals get put together under certain conditions and bang, the thing goes off. So most natural sciences are not positivist, they are realist. They accept that there is a real social world independent of our theories and concepts of it, and that in a way the observable events are just the surface. Underneath the observable events, the empirical level, are mechanisms. There's things happening that are causing changes. And below that, there are structures that have the causal power. So just to give you an example, the criminal justice system is a real entity with real effects. People end up in prison because of it. So there is a thing that is a social construction that exists under the level of observability. Nobody can see the criminal justice system. But in the end, it has real effects when you're up before the beak and he says that you've got 3 months. That's what's meant by a realist view of social entities, that there are things around us that are real, that they actually exist, they exist independently, and they have real causal power. So from a realist point of view, I'm assuming that the social entity called the treatment system has real social powers, and that when people come into contact with it, they can relate to it and respond to it in different ways. And so that's the sort of philosophy of science behind this. I wanted to move away from positivism to the idea of, okay, there's something going on in these programs where there's a causal change happening, and that this cause is likely to be contextual. So mechanisms are enabled or constrained by contexts. So there are certain contexts which constrain mechanism. So let's say you've got a treatment centre which involves a lot of boo-hooing and expressing your feelings, right? And you're in a culture where it's deeply prohibited for men, for example, to display their feelings. Use face. It's going to make the program in which one's invited to emote very difficult. People don't want to do that. So there is a cultural context. If on the other hand you set up the same program in California, then it's going to be a lot easier to emote and to do your boo-hooing and your horse whispering and the other stuff. So there is a context. Things work depending on how acceptable and how much sense they make to people. So if you want to explain things in a realist paradigm, you're looking to understand what are the contexts that constrain or facilitate mechanisms that then produce certain kinds of outcome. And under what conditions will the mechanisms of an intervention be enabled or constrained? How does the intervention enter the reasoning of subjects or fail to do so? So, when people go to a treatment centre, somehow their consciousness, their reasoning, which doesn't mean just cognitions, it includes emotions crucially, which I'll explain in a second. If it does enter the reasoning of subjects in a particular way, then it will have that particular outcome. If it doesn't, it won't. Now, why do we need to understand these mechanisms? What's the point of it? Well, it's not just curiosity. The knowledge of such causal mechanisms is highly desirable, as they can be expected to focus research efforts, eliminate superstitious elements of treatments, that is, things that are in the treatment that people think are essential and causal but actually are not doing anything. You know, if you want to get rid of a headache, I recommend you put on a purple hat, stand on your head and take an aspirin. It works. But the superstitious elements there are taking the aspirin. No, it's the purple hat and the standing on your head. You don't need to do that bit, you just need to take the aspirin. So, and allow for more efficient training of clinicians. If we understand what the mechanisms are, then we can start training facilitators, counsellors, treatment staff generally to enable those mechanisms to happen. So my research question was, how does transformative change occur in rehabilitation programs, and how is it facilitated or constrained by contextual factors? And I looked at 3 comparable abstinence aid programs in Liverpool, Bournemouth and Essex, which I thought was interesting because, you know, England is not a common culture. It's a melange of things, and I thought it would be interesting to think that Essex is not very like Merseyside is not very much like Bournemouth. There are all kinds of things, but these programs are the same design, they're implemented in more or less the same way, and I looked at 2 settings. These 2 in phase 1 and this in phase 2, and I'll explain what that was all about in a minute. Here's the outline of the research. So I wanted to look at what the research was saying about possible mechanisms. I wanted to do some observation of the treatment program and some semi-structured interviews, which were 27 of them, and I'll be showing you some of those. And looking at the program manuals, what do the program manuals say about how it all works? To develop an evaluative questionnaire and to move into what are called theory-driven interviews. So I actually sat down with clients and said, this is my emerging theory, help me elaborate it, help me refine it. And I had to use a theoretical framework to kind of analyse it and put it together, and you end up with an explanatory model, at least you hope you do. I did in the end. So what I did in the first instance was talk to people in a very unstructured way. So I rang up the treatment program leader and said, I want to come and do this research. Here's an explanation of my research. Please could you give it to the clients and see if they would be interested. Everybody was. Every single person in all of these units wanted to be involved in this research. So they signed the consent form and so on and so forth. I ended up, because of time constraints and because of the amount of material, interviewing 7 clients at Liverpool and 3 counsellors, 7 clients at Bournemouth and 3 counsellors. And I basically was asking the clients, well, what is happening for you here? How are you changing? And how are those changes being produced? I mean, that was the gist of the questions that I was asking these people to talk about. And counsellors, how does treatment work here? What do you think you are doing in your counselling role? I must tell you that the clients were much more articulate and produced much richer data than the counsellors did. Even though the counsellors were doing a bloody good job, they were not able to articulate their model particularly well, which I thought was quite interesting in itself. So how did I analyse this? I'm going to show you a bit of qualitative analysis in a minute, and it's colours, so it's sort of black and white. You'll see some colours on the screen. It might be interesting. I remember when colour television came along, and it was great. You know, it was a bit of an improvement on black and white. So we're going to get some colour in a second. What I did was to listen to the interviews over and over and over again. Qualitative analysis is hard work. And to try and say, well, what are the statements about change? What were the contexts which threatened or facilitated that change? And what were the outcomes? And what I particularly was interested in was not a thematic analysis, but a connecting analysis. So what was this, and how did it connect to that, and how did it connect to the next thing? And I began to tentatively identify context, mechanisms, and outcomes, and I began to theoretically redescribe that. And I'm going to have to sort of try and tell you what that involves. So these are some of the things that were coming out. What was interesting, that people had individual personal situations, and they were very variable. So some people said they were in a bad way, they had a personal crisis, they had a suicide attempt, they were hospitalised. Some people said they'd lost everything, they lost their family, their material possessions, their business. A couple of people said that the family rescued me and helped me into treatment. But the point about that was it was not universal. So some people had no family involvement, some people were not in a bad way, some were. And that didn't seem to, each of those applied to less than half the sample. But when they started talking about treatment characteristics, the thing that was universal was that they regarded the treatment program as accepting and welcoming. That was something, in order for me to change, it needed to be welcoming and accepting. And I'll show you what they were saying about that. That it needs to be clearly structured. They loved the structure. Not everybody likes structure, but the predictability, the transparency, the clarity of the programs, the fact that they were inducted into this program and it kind of worked as advertised. It produced a feeling of safety across Liverpool and Bournemouth. And when I went to Essex, they really confirmed that. And these were explicitly cited as critical. If it hadn't been accepting and welcoming, if it hadn't been clearly structured, I probably wouldn't be making the changes that I'm making. So there's a context there about the treatment environment. And it seemed that there was a process in which people really didn't participate very actively in the treatment for a couple of weeks. They kind of hung back and they began to build trust. It wasn't just based on identification. The most common thing that people talked about was that they heard somebody courageously sharing about themselves and it kind of blew them away. So somebody began to talk about their childhood abuse and this person said, I couldn't believe it, this person was really talking. And I thought to myself, if he can do it or she can do it, then maybe I can do it. So there was this idea of admiring the courage of others who take risks and then being inspired to take risks for themselves, and that got an affirming response. And that process generally took about 2 weeks. So many of the interviewees said, look, I didn't really say much for the first couple of weeks. I hung back, but I began to see people I admired. I began to like what other people were saying, and I took some risks myself. And then the challenge thing. I had a woman as one of my interviews. She said, I went to a private treatment centre 18 months ago. My brother paid for it. They never challenged me there. I didn't get challenged in any way. And as a result, I never learned anything about myself. Here, I've been challenged. Now, that doesn't mean confronted. It doesn't mean that people were aggressively saying you're a minimiser, you're an addict, you don't know what's coming there, you need to listen to others because what you's in your own head doesn't make any sense. It wasn't that kind of challenge. It was, hold on, we don't buy that you've got nothing of value to offer this group, or you're presenting yourself as very timid. In this case, in this woman's case, she was voiceless. She didn't allow herself to express anything. She didn't feel legitimated to express anything. And the group got concerned about that. And it turned out that she felt that she'd just been hardwired as a shy, timid person, that she was just made that way. And in the discussion with the one-to-one counsellor, it turned out that actually what had gone on, this was a family-assigned role, that she had been told that she had no voice, that she'd been told that she was not allowed to express her feelings. And that reframing completely changed her self-perspective, and she became, I was there doing the field work, she became instantly amazingly assertive in a really appropriate way. And moreover, because it was a day program, she was able to go home, and her nephew was abusing her, verbally abusing her sister, and she was able to assert herself with that guy and tell him that his behaviour was unacceptable, and he backed down and listened to her, and she comes back into group, and my God, this works. I don't have to be a voiceless, timid person anymore. So the challenge needed to be respectful, and it needed to be in the basis of the trust. Nobody got any challenging that worked when they were still building trust. Once they built trust, they were prepared to listen to the challenge. And the challenge was very difficult. In each case, the challenge was not easily accepted. It made people angry, it made people scared. They thought that my own reality is so pervasive that I don't understand what these people are saying because it's so different to my self-image. But in fact, people reflected on that challenge. They began to think about it. And the people who were doing well, it began to make some kind of sense, and it began to be a suggestion for future action. When they changed their behaviour, for example, this woman became more vocal, more assertive, and took this behaviour out of the treatment into her family life. That was very much affirmed and encouraged. And people began, this is really the key. It's not the behaviour change. It's the fact that this process was producing reciprocal care. people began to care about the people in their group, and they began to understand that they really cared about them. And that it's that development of care, commitment, emotional attachment that actually turned out to be one of the most important mechanisms of change. What were the outcomes? Well, again, remember this is phase 1, and I needed to test it all in phase 2, but it seemed as though what was happening was that people were changing what they cared about. A couple of people said to me explicitly, when I was at the end of my addiction, I didn't care about anything except for money and drugs. People very often said that. I mean, a guy had gone home to have his one mum do his washing or something, and his mother had said to him, well, what do you like? Meaning, what do you want for pudding or something? And he thought she was saying, what do you like in the world? What means it? And he thought, nothing means anything to me. Nothing at all. I don't care about anything except drugs and money. And now, obviously, that's quite explicit, and it doesn't apply to everybody, but essentially one's values, one's commitments become narrowed to the addiction. So the addiction becomes essentially, what I'm going to argue, is one's identity. At least in the hierarchy of identities, it becomes very important. What was happening in treatment was that people were changing what they cared about. They were beginning to set new priorities. They were beginning to talk about values. They were talking about new commitments. And as a result of that, they were getting different emotional responses, and their confidence increased. People told me, when I came in here, my confidence was shot to bits. I didn't have any confidence, and this process is rebuilding it. And they began to have increased self-esteem. I'm going to flip through to the analysis, because again there were some counter-examples. Somebody came in and disclosed something that the group couldn't handle. They were rejected as part of the group, and 2 or 3 days later they left and started using again. Another person was unable to deal with the distractions of a whole raft of problems to do with social services, and they couldn't deal with it, and they left. So there were a number of counter-examples. But it obviously was possible to transcend that, because all the interviewees said, well, I felt like leaving. After the first 2 days, I couldn't wait to get out of here. So how did you stay? Well, people encouraged me, and I went home and thought about it, and I realised I had no alternative, etc. I'm going to go straight to, this is, what I've flipped over is a part of the theoretical idea that essentially we are people, and inside is a brain, and it's quite an important thing. But essentially we're in relationship to social entities, and these social structures have an impact on us. It's the schooling, the criminal justice system, it's the housing, it's the politics, it's the groups we belong to. And social science is very interested in the way that agency, that is a person being able to act intentionally and to choose what they do, how that relates to the social structures that they encounter. And that was the theoretical basis of a lot of my work. Why, I'm very worried about brainism and addiction treatment, the idea that somehow it's all in the brain, and other people who say it's all in society, and it's actually, you can't conflate one to the other. Brains are important, society is important. This is the people. So I'm going to show you an interview. I'm going to talk for only 10 more minutes. So and here's some colour. Look, reds and greens and blues and all kinds of stuff. On the left, which is probably the bit that you will want to look at, is what this man was saying to me. And they are the bits which were selected out. So this person says, I should ask for a Merseysider to come up and read this out, really. But it's all right, John, I won't ask you. I felt quite lost within myself. I felt I'd lost some of my identity. I mean, I didn't mention identity. I was very careful not to suggest any ideas or words to them. I felt vulnerable. I felt in a fragile state of mind. And I'm analysing it as the dark blue is something about emotional identity deterioration. Wherever that appears, there will be a dark blue colour. And I'm very interested in reflexivity. He was talking, I felt quite lost within myself. So there's some sort of internal process going on. He talks about the support from the counsellors, not only from the counsellors but from the community. There's always a great sense of compassion. The compassion I felt, the warmth was amazing. It did help me open up a lot of things. It helped me got a lot of things in my chest, open up areas of myself, but also able to listen a bit more. So that's coded as the compassionate context is the green stuff. The trust and the engagement with others is the dark red. The bright red is about opening up. And again, he begins to talk about an internal conversation. He keeps saying, hang on, wow, these people really care. Now, who's talking to who? He was having an internal conversation, realizing that things were happening. My God, these people really care about me. But he would express it as an internal conversation, which became a very important theoretical part of my findings. I can feel for other people. I mean, I've heard other people's life stories, but even interacting in group therapy, I find I can relate to people. I mean, if somebody shares something I can relate to, I can relate back. And he talks about how that helps. I find it uplifting. I find it helpful as well. So you're beginning to get the greens, which are the improvements, the increased self-worth, the feeling uplifted. He begins to talk about, I lost my sense of worth, I lost my sense of values in addiction, I lost my goals, my values and my morals without a shadow of a doubt. I'm listening to the counsellors, and sometimes they put things in a different perspective, although I can relate to it exactly what they mean, in a different light maybe. And I can say, whoa, and I can see the old me. So again, he's framing this in terms of a reflexive process where he begins to think about the things he's hearing and the things that people are saying to him. And he keeps saying, whoa, whoa. And we'll see how that works in a minute. I find a lot of my values are coming back. I'm most definitely changing. I mean, as you're probably aware of, I've not just this weekend, I've probably been since I've been here. I've been through 5 weeks, and I've had 4 or 5, when I say crises, normally I would have walked out on them. I would have normally, without a shadow of a doubt, there's no ifs or buts, but I do feel as if I've taken on board some of the tools that we learn here. Now, what had happened to this guy was that he had an alcoholic partner, and she had ranted and, first of all, come around and ranted and raved and gone out drunk into the street and dodged cars and just basically made a mayhem with him. And then, after he wouldn't buy into that, she'd thrown himself in the Mersey, threw herself in the Mersey, got hauled out by the police with a broken arm. And so this chap, Jason, as I'm calling him, I must remember to call him Jason, not his real name, had to go and visit his wife in hospital. And basically, she just abused him again. Just basically told him what a useless piece of scum he was, and so on and so forth. Now, previously, he would have ended up fighting. So normally, she took her coat off and she was like swearing at me, and I never made any. Normally, it would have led to violence. We would have ended up fighting. But I just felt stronger as a person to step back from that. Whoa, which is massive for me. If you look at past history, it was a very volatile relationship, which it was. There was all kinds of triggers for violence, for conflict. I'd made it quite clear by this time, I'm not going to fight with you. At one point she hit me, but I did not fight back. I can feel myself changing. I feel I'm getting my old values back. So what is going on there, and I have to cut to the chase, is this stuff is first order emotional response. This is just how I respond. My wife is shouting at me and abusing me, and I get angry and I retaliate. Now, as a result of his involvement in this group and thinking of and developing his reflexivity, he was able to stand back for it. And the result was that he didn't react, and he was able to walk away, and he felt great about that. So the second order emotional response was, I feel proud of myself. Now, and he was sad. I must admit, it's about a 10-minute walk from the bus stop to the station. This is after the hospital visit. And walking to the station, I felt a bit sad because of the way she'd spoken to me. But then again, I was thinking, I thought about myself and what I was like, and I thought, again, tremendous reflexivity. The whole thing is turning into a way of reflecting on his being, who he is, what's important to him, and so on and so forth. I feel very proud of it. I'm absolutely over the moon. No, because I can feel the changes in myself, I really can. And then he goes back and talks about the beginning. Yeah, quite intense. I found it intense, and the whole honesty thing, being honest with yourself, that comes across to me here, In addiction, you lie, you connive, you manipulate, just the fucking sheer honesty coming back at you. Come on, look at this in the right frame of mind, really. And that's helped a lot. Look at things for what they are, that's something, And this is the counsellor who talks about, gives him an image of a critical panel in his head that's sort of judging and criticising everything. And he says, my counsellor says, don't listen to that panel, don't judge yourself. Basically, keep it in the day, keep it unimportant, keep it in the day. I think that's massive. So developing kind of techniques to manage that old critical stuff in the head. Anyway, oh yes, so I ask him about some details. Sometimes when we go into a conversation, a confrontation, and somebody says something and you think, that's landed, and the other thing is, hang on, well, that's not mine, that's yours. That's not mine. But in the past you deal with it in the old way, you just take it as said, and you would just take it from there and react, and you're off. And it lands and it seems to stick with you. Yeah, that's not mine, you own that. I'm learning a lot from that, and not just with my partner, my wife, I've been in other conversations and situations, and I thought, hey, that's not mine, and I'm not even going to rise to that, that's just going straight over. But in the past it would have landed, I could have got to me, and then I'm having a drink. So I have 27 of these. This is a tiny snippet of one interview. There were 27 of these interviews, and it was amazingly consistent. Everybody was an individual, nobody was exactly the same, but that process of reflexivity, what I have found here since I've been here, not only from the counsellors but from the community or the group, there's always a great sense of compassion. I mean, depending on the numbers, it varies, as you know. Sometimes there's 16 or can be 20 people, really, to be quite honest. Apart from my first name, they don't really know that much about me until I've read my life story aloud. So of course not everything was in that, but I just found this feeling of warmth. I mean, I think of it really, apart from the addiction, which we all got in common, they don't really know you. And he just said, I've never experienced like that in my life. And what he was talking about was that reciprocity. Now, I'm going to have to zoom through this, but what I did with all that analysis was to produce a questionnaire based on the context, mechanisms and outcomes that I tentatively identified, and then shoved that questionnaire at a load of other clients in Essex. And they heavily endorsed the emerging model. There was an enormous amount of agreement that the important things, and what they were, sorry, I think I've got it here, so these are the important things. I found the treatment program accepting and welcoming. The treatment program felt like a safe place, and the program here felt well structured. There was complete universal endorsement of that. These were, again, interviews where people elaborated, gave a lot of detail about how that applied to them. I began to see that the counsellors in the group cared about me. I began to identify with others in my group. The honesty and courage of others has helped me open up, and the way I think about myself is changing as a result of challenging. And I have new priorities in my life. What and who I care about is changing. I feel my values are changing as a result of this program. I feel clearer about the kind of life I want. This is very early stage. This is people in the first weeks after they become abstinent. What did the interviews add? They refined the idea of safety. They said a lot more about not just safety to express feelings, which is what pretty much the Bournemouth and the Liverpool lot were talking about, but freedom from temptations to use, the structure of the program, the sky-high barriers, drug testing, and there was clear behavioural expectations. People found that deeply daunting when they first went in. They thought they couldn't handle it. They all had to hand in their mobile phones. And one woman said, I can't do it, I need my phone. There's people out there talking about me, I need my phone to defend myself. But you have to hand it in. And within 5 weeks, she was leaving it in the taxi. She was leaving it at the program. She thought it was a complete delight not to have the phone. So people are very daunted by the expectations, but came to be welcomed as giving a sense of security and trust. And they also helped me clarify some of the mechanisms and the outcomes. And one statement from one of the Essex interviews, which I thought was great. I came back here a couple of months later, very much in a recovery state of mind. I'd moved forward to the point where I can start to embrace it. I can give you a specific example, the peer evaluations. We did our first peer evaluations yesterday, and I really cared. I could feel the feelings inside. I really cared about the people I was talking to. I cared about offending them. I felt good about affirming them, and I was concerned about what people had to say about me. Whereas last time I was here 6 months ago, I didn't care. I was almost like a robot. I could have said anything to anybody, and it didn't mean anything. I think recovery is caring in quite a big way, caring about yourself, caring about other people, caring about what's going on around you, as opposed to just caring about obtaining money and obtaining drugs. And for me, this was a very nice sort of central state. So I haven't explained Archer's theoretical model, but she talks about morphogenesis, the idea that certain interactions between social entities and individuals can produce change. So I'm not going to go through that because it's deeply technical. If anybody wants a copy of the thesis, they can read all about it, and a lot of rich material from the interviews. but the programme provides an opportunity for active participation in a joint endeavour. I think that's so critical. If you make your treatment into a set of individual therapies and focus on that, you don't give the people the opportunity to participate in a joint endeavour. Building of trust either through identification with others, admiration of their honesty and openness, and the apprehension that others care for you. The development of mutual valuing and care, the activity of this joint endeavour consisting in part in the giving and receiving of challenge and the effect of this on the internal conversation, the rearrangement and prioritising of concerns in the internal conversation, the emergent powers of the internal conversation to initiate an identity project. And what appeared to be going on was people began to reformulate their identities. It was just a beginning in terms of the commitments and values that they had, the people they were connected to. And of course there's an availability and accessibility of new social roles. The street agency in Essex offers a mentoring programme, Foundation 66, so they can go out and become recovery mentors, or they can go and work in the Brink, which is a recovery cafe in Liverpool. In other words, society is beginning to offer social roles which are now accessible to people that they can occupy in the beginnings of their recoveries. Its contexts were timely referral from the client, a welcoming, accepting, consistent and clearly structured treatment environment, norms of respect and honesty in the whole treatment community, clear behavioural expectations which significantly challenge the client but which are achievable, and the provision of recovery-based social roles to occupy. The mechanisms, the building of trust through norms of acceptance, honesty and the sharing of vulnerability, the modification of the internal conversation through conjoint practice, challenge, internalisation of new appraisals, new commitments and new capabilities. I connect that to some Vygotskian stuff, which is another theoretical informed for this research. And the outcomes within treatment. I'm not talking about, this doesn't say anything about what happens after treatment. You get a stronger, clearer sense of self as experiences increased confidence, ability to feel and to care, new personal and social commitments. And these emergent outcomes permit greater reflexivity and risk-taking, thereby reciprocally reinforcing both the mechanisms, and people begin to the initiation of a new identity project or projects. I mean, sometimes that was explicit, as I was a bus driver, I lost my job, but I'm going to train as a train driver. Or it could be, I want to be a paramedic. But generally speaking, it wasn't in that form. It was, I'm going to change my priorities, I'm going to have different commitments now, I'm going to, and again, please remember that identities are not the whole of a person. You have a hierarchy of identities. What's so magic about 12-step recovery as opposed to a cult is that it allows you to have that identity and another identity as a worker, a professional, a parent, a family person, a friend, or whatever. There's, the addict identity or the recovering identity is not a totality. It's just in the hierarchy of one's identity. And I personally think of identity as the things one is committed to, the things one cares about. Okay, so what is the implication? So this really is the end of the talk. I'm sorry, I've exceeded my time allowance, but and only by rushing a bit, but never mind. So we need to understand the mechanisms of change and what activates them and what constrains them. Because in fact, these programs were brilliant at activating them. Overall, people were doing really well in there. Fantastic completion rates, real sense of engagement. We need to train practitioners. The model for training counsellors and therapists these days comes from a bourgeois, individualist, one-to-one model. Talking to people essentially in a confidential environment. It's got nothing to do with this practice. This is about facilitating groups of people, it's about facilitating communities. We need to really up that skills and expertise, and we need to provide ongoing training and supervision. Most people working in group-based treatment centres across the world have never had a proper group therapy training. They may come with diplomas in counselling, and I'm not suggesting that counselling skills aren't a very useful foundation, but in some senses this is not an activity like individual counselling, it's something quite different. And hopefully I'm on a panel tomorrow talking about the credibility of treatment, and I'm hoping to enlarge on training and supervision needs there. The relationship of the evidence-based interventions to this model of practice, we need to work it out, because everybody's been told to train in these evidence-based interventions, and I have actually written a chapter in the thesis about the relationship of those to this model. I obviously haven't got time to talk about it now, but maybe somebody wants to bring it up as a question, I don't know. I am going to, prompt. I'm now going to, I think that's the end. Yes, it's the end. Fantastic. We've got about 35 minutes of possible for discussion, talking about this, whether or not anything meaningful or useful came out of that, please feel free to intervene in any way you wish. There's a microphone apparently for those who wish to be heard more clearly, or you could just shout.
I'm curious how this relates to the thing you said at the beginning of that the doctors seem to go on and do well, and these women, only 10% of them do.
Yes.
And how does that relate to what you just told us on this topic?
Very important question. It relates to this issue of recovery capital. What appeared to be, the people who were in these programs had a social range, but on the whole they were ordinary, what used to be called working class people. They were not, there was one person from the city who'd come up to Sharp Essex because he wanted to get out of the city and have a sort of anonymous treatment. But on the whole, these are, not particularly privileged people, they're not particularly hugely disadvantaged either, they're just ordinary folk. And what I think was going on was that they had become estranged from their recovery capital. For example, there was a woman who was 50 odd years old. She was a grandmother, so I think she was mid-50s, and she'd been a cocaine user. She'd found cocaine when she was about 45, and her daughter found out about it and took her grandchildren away. And in a sense, what the treatment program was doing was, first of all, picking her face up so that she could hold her head up again. It was providing a community, a recovery club, and she said, when I came into treatment, I told everyone I was going on a floristry course because I couldn't stand the shame of being in treatment, and now I shout it from the rooftops. So I think what doctors have got is both lots of opportunities to restore their professional careers. They very often do already have a family that may have been damaged, but in some ways it's often intact. They often have money. They often have all of these. The people in Sharp don't generally have those advantages. And I think the reason why the doctors do well is because they've got monumental recovery capital as a group. And also that they have monitoring and constraints. It's not just the positive stuff, it's the fact that you have to jump through hoops as a recovering doctor to get your license back or whatever it is, though that's also very useful. What I think this model is doing is providing a structure that can sustain people in that way. So it's very different. It's not a professional structure. It's the transmission of a lonely, isolated, alienated person who will have some work to do to regain their family relationships, the relationships with their children, etc. There's now a group of people you can connect to, who you can belong to. In that sense, it provides social capital. So I think what's going on there is it evens up the field. Granfield and Cloud showed that people with high recovery capital didn't really need mutual aid. They might enjoy it, they might benefit from it in a way, but Granfield and Cloud were looking at people who exited from treatment without any of this stuff. And they found out generally that they had these social structures in place to support their recoveries and the ability to have a completely different identity. These folk don't. The dependence levels are very high, the damage is usually pretty severe. And so, yeah, I think the reason why people have differential outcomes is because they have differential opportunities to recover, and that what treatment programs should be doing is building recovery capital, trying to help people accrue this social and cultural capital that will support their recoveries. Does that make any sense? Generally, middle class people do better than people lower in the social scale. Doctors do particularly well, but I think particularly because there is this very clear monitoring and route to incentives and rewards for doing the right thing. And recovery is possible. Addiction is a powerful thing, but people can choose to exit it, and they do so in their millions. So it's not something that's going to grip you forever. But for some reason, some people find it easier to have a frame to climb on and sustain their recoveries and maintain that. And some people find it more difficult. And I think treatment is needed to provide that framework for people who don't have it. It's more complicated than that, but that's sort of the general idea. We certainly yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is whether you have any experience of mixed groups. In other words, I love the idea of this cohesion and so on within the groups and the welcoming factor and so on and so forth. But did you have an experience of groups where you've got mixed addictions like gambling, crack cocaine or whatever,
Yes.
and alcoholism together, and would you find the same cohesion amongst?
It becomes the addiction becomes almost
substances?
irrelevant. People were not talking. I interviewed people for a long time. Not one mentioned. I mean, some people did say, "Well, I came with a cocaine addiction and I met these alcohol addicts, and actually we found out we got quite a lot in common."
Right.
But you get that not actually on the basis of the addiction, but on the basis of certain human characteristics. And also, people were connecting not just by identifying, but by valuing what they did. So people said, well, there are people who are not like me here, but I admire them anyway because they're being courageous in what they share. Ethnically, that was a very homogeneous group. By chance, virtually everybody in this research was white British. But I have worked with groups that are much more diverse ethnically, and I think it becomes a problem in some cases, but it also works perfectly well as well, provided there is that acceptance, that welcome, that structure. You have to make certain cultural adjustments in some cases, but so for example, if you wanted to do it in Saudi Arabia or something, you'd probably have to adjust it quite a bit. But on the whole, this is a sort of human process, I think. It's a shame. Certainly men and women. I mean, men and women responding to treatment is a very interesting thing for me because it's been clearly shown by Kelly that women use recovery resources quite differently to the way men use them. But nevertheless, this was working in pretty much the same way for both genders. So, the way that women talked about the change process, their lives had been different. They were living in a society. I mean, for example, one woman had been more or less controlled by her husband. She married him when she was 16. Every life choice had been made by him and not by her. And then he then abandoned her. She in the middle of China. So he went out to do business in China and divorced her, I think by text or something. Well, this woman didn't know anything. I mean, her whole life had been structured by her husband, and suddenly she had to discover how to take charge of her own life again, and that was quite a challenge for her. In fact, she'd ended up in hospital trying to kill herself, and then ended up in Sharp and did very well actually. So everybody's an individual, and everybody's going through this process in their own way, but the process seemed very consistent. And I don't think if it had been more ethnically mixed, it would have seen a very different picture. I don't know. But
Yeah, I can endorse that. I facilitate a health professionals group for doctors and nurses. I've done for nearly 30 years. And once the new participants give a brief history, the substance of choice becomes irrelevant. And because we're treating the disease or dis-ease of addiction, the use of the substance or the behaviour is merely the symptoms that.
well, I think so. And certainly in this frame, it is. Yeah.
So they've been using cocaine, they have gambling addiction, sex addiction. That's irrelevant. It's the attitude.
I completely agree with that. I mean, it's not that sometimes people have difficulties getting over that, but once they're over it, it becomes irrelevant. What addiction is a narrowing of, it's a narrowing of one's life concerns, it's a narrowing of one's identity. And for me, that's much more important than any kind of craving or brain processes. We know that, yes, my wife has a cigarette-shaped hole in her brain. She wants to smoke. When she's 80 years old, she's going to resume smoking because so there's a constant idea that cigarette smoking is a luxury that she's given up, and she continues to resent that. I gave up smoking and I don't have that cigarette-shaped hole. I don't know why. But nevertheless, I don't think my wife is going, when I go home tomorrow, I'm going to find her smoking. It's just that something in her, possibly in her brain. I mean, again, don't get me started on brainism. You hear sometimes in conferences that brains decide things, or that this bit of your brain makes this. Brains don't decide, people decide. A person is an emergent process, and transcendent from brains. And the idea that your brain no more makes a decision than your thermostat makes a decision it's time to turn the heating on. Clearly we all depend on a neural substrate, but the point of being human is to transcend that. We are a social, cultural animal, and we exist in a cultural, social context. And the idea of trying to reduce that to brain function is just absurd. Philosophically incoherent, for one thing. But I think there's a tendency to kind of explain, yes.
So now thank you, first of all. You have identified some factors that you considered are essential to the effectiveness of a treatment program. So imagine the next step would be to set up a treatment program that has those elements, and then you go back to the same, now let's find out whether this works or not.
Yes, it would be, I mean, this is a tiny, tiny dip in the, it's, PhD thesis just does a little drop of knowledge, and you're quite right, we need to test this out. Is this what's really going on in all treatment programs? I doubt it. But if you wanted to set up a treatment program that was effective with a broad range of people, the next thing to do is I'd like to go and see if this works in Zimbabwe, or I'd like to see if it works with, a women's program, or I'd like to see if it works the same way, and see if this is. I doubt very much whether you're going to find something completely universal. But exactly, I mean, it's the whole point of, is this something that is just limited to this treatment setting, or is it something that's generalizable?
I was encouraging you to go back to the introduction that you gave us. You'd go back to the same paradigm then.
To the
same paradigm now, to then ask in an evidence-based manner whether these treatment interventions.
Yes, I mean, a realist would never say that you shouldn't empirically test your ideas, and of course you would want to, but you're not going to see, I mean, for example, reducing class sizes is a randomized controlled trial intervention into schools, and in Tennessee they did that, and the SAT scores rose. So people began to think, oh, well, that's what you need to do. Look, here it is, a randomized controlled trial. It shows you that if you put the kids into smaller classes, then their scores rise. They transferred that to another state, I think it was California, and the SAT scores fell, plummeted. So what was going on was that the context was different. The Californian system didn't have the resources to manage the smaller classes. They didn't have enough staff. They didn't have the environment that was needed. So paradoxically, something that had been experimentally shown to work in one place didn't work in another. So one has to ask, what form does this need to take in different cultures in different places? And yes, some kind of testing of that would be useful. I mean, what this study does not show is what the outcomes of the treatment were in terms of sobriety. I mean, in fact, they're pretty good. I've followed them up, but this study doesn't say anything about that. So yeah, you do return to a kind of empirical testing of your ideas, for sure. John?
Hi Tim, thank you so much. And I don't know, just to give you a little compliment, how fortunate we are in the field to have you in your capacity as a trainer and leading research like this. I think we forget about that, and that's my personal opinion. So thank you. We've had discussions in the past about effectiveness of counsellors in group situations.
Yeah.
And the power of the group and the individual counsellor. What could you say about that? As you said here, there has to be more of a focus on group dynamics and group training and group facilitation. A lot of courses don't include group work training, as you said.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about that? And again, if you like, what is the effectiveness of a counsellor, the counselling role in treatment these days, in your opinion, or from what you've seen? That makes sense.
I mean, it makes perfect sense, and thank you for that question. I don't know how to make an easy answer. I think what you want is people who have a profound humanity, first of all, who are going to put their ability to relate and care for the people that are in the treatment first. Because you can't get too abstract. You can't learn how to relate systemically by doing a systemic training. You have to do the systemic training and combine it with your humanity. You have to it can't get too abstract, in other words. I want people who can think relationally. I mean, I think Western society is far too individualist. It tends to think in terms of, human beings being kind of fleshy computers looking out at the world and appraising it. Whereas I believe identity and emotion is profoundly social. And human beings don't make any sense except in relationship to other human beings. So I think the ability to think relationally and not to think people have got something in their head that's called addiction. I mean, I think this medical kind of diagnosis, and for example, there was a woman who was 50 odd years old. She was a grandmother, so I think she was mid-50s, and she'd been a cocaine user. She'd found cocaine when she was about 45, and her daughter found out about it and took her grandchildren away. And in a sense, what the treatment program was doing was, first of all, picking her face up so that she could hold her head up again. It was providing a community, a recovery club. And she said, when I came into treatment, I told everyone I was going on a floristry course because I couldn't stand the shame of being in treatment. And now I shout it from the rooftops. So I think what doctors have got is both lots of opportunities to restore their professional careers. They very often do already have a family that may have been damaged, but in some ways it's often intact. They often have money. They often have all of these. The people in Sharp don't generally have those advantages. And I think the reason why the doctors do well is because they've got monumental recovery capital as a group. And also that they have monitoring and constraints. It's not just the positive stuff, it's the fact that you have to jump through hoops as a recovering doctor to get your license back or whatever it is, though that's also very useful. What I think this model is doing is providing a structure that can sustain people in that way. So it's very different. It's not a professional structure. It's the transmission of a lonely, isolated, alienated person who will have some work to do to regain their family relationships, the relationships with their children, etc. There's now a group of people you can connect to, who you can belong to. In that sense, it provides social capital. So I think what's going on there is it evens up the field. Granfield and Cloud showed that people with high recovery capital didn't really need mutual aid. They might enjoy it, they might benefit from it in a way, but Granfield and Cloud were looking at people who exited from treatment without any of this stuff. And they found out generally that they had these social structures in place to support their recoveries and the ability to have a completely different identity. These folk don't. I mean, the dependence levels are very high, the damage is usually pretty severe. And so, yeah, I think the reason why people have differential outcomes is because they have differential opportunities to recover, and that what treatment programs should be doing is building recovery capital, trying to help people accrue this social and cultural capital that will support their recoveries. Does that make any sense? Generally, middle class people do better than people lower in the social scale. Doctors do particularly well, but I think particularly because there is this very clear monitoring and route to incentives and rewards for doing the right thing. And recovery is possible. Addiction is a powerful thing, but people can choose to exit it, and they do so in their millions. So it's not something that's going to grip you forever. But for some reason, some people find it easier to have a frame to climb on and sustain their recoveries and maintain that. And some people find it more difficult. And I think treatment is needed to provide that framework for people who don't have it. It's more complicated than that, but that's sort of the general idea. We certainly yes.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. My question is whether you have any experience of mixed groups. In other words, I love the idea of this cohesion and so on within the groups and the welcoming factor and so on and so forth. But do you have an experience of groups where you've got mixed addictions like gambling, crack cocaine or whatever,
Yes.
and alcoholism together, and would you find the same cohesion amongst?
It becomes the addiction becomes almost
substances?
irrelevant. People were not talking. I interviewed people for a long time. Not one mentioned. I mean, some people did say, "Well, I came with a cocaine addiction and I met these alcohol addicts, and actually we found out we got quite a lot in common."
Right.
But you get that not actually on the basis of the addiction, but on the basis of certain human characteristics. And also, people were connecting not just by identifying, but by valuing what they did. So people said, well, there are people who are not like me here, but I admire them anyway because they're being courageous in what they share. Ethnically, that was a very homogeneous group. By chance, virtually everybody in this research was white British. But I have worked with groups that are much more diverse ethnically, and I think it becomes a problem in some cases, but it also works perfectly well as well, provided there is that acceptance, that welcome, that structure. You have to make certain cultural adjustments in some cases, but so for example, if you wanted to do it in Saudi Arabia or something, you'd probably have to adjust it quite a bit. But on the whole, this is a sort of human process, I think. It's a shame. Certainly men and women. I mean, men and women responding to treatment is a very interesting thing for me because it's been clearly shown by Kelly that women use recovery resources quite differently to the way men use them. But nevertheless, this was working in pretty much the same way for both genders.
Mm.
So, you know, the way that women talked about the change process, their lives had been different. They were living in a society. I mean, for example, one woman had been more or less controlled by her husband. She married him when she was 16. Every life choice had been made by him and not by her. And then he then abandoned her. In the middle of China. So he went out to do business in China and divorced her, I think by text or something. Well, this woman didn't know anything. I mean, you know, her whole life had been structured by her husband, and suddenly she had to discover how to take charge of her own life again, and that was quite a challenge for her. In fact, she'd ended up in hospital trying to kill herself, and then ended up in Sharp and did very well, actually. So everybody's an individual, and everybody's going through this process in their own way, but the process seemed very consistent. And I don't think if it had been more ethnically mixed, it would have seen a very different picture. I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, I can endorse that. I facilitate a health professionals group for doctors and nurses. I've done for nearly 30 years. And once the new participants give a brief history, the substance of choice becomes irrelevant. And because we're treating the disease or dis-ease of addiction, the use of the substance or the behaviour is merely the symptoms that.
Well, I think so. And certainly in this frame, it is. Yeah.
So they've been using cocaine, they have gambling addiction, sex addiction. That's irrelevant. It's the attitude.
Right.
I completely agree with that. I mean, it's not that sometimes people have difficulties getting over that, but once they're over it, it becomes irrelevant. You know, what addiction is a narrowing of, you know, it's a narrowing of one's life concerns, it's a narrowing of one's identity. And for me, that's much more important than any kind of craving or brain processes. We know that, you know, yes, my wife has a cigarette-shaped hole in her brain. She wants to smoke. When she's 80 years old, she's going to resume smoking because she, you know, so there's a constant idea that cigarette smoking is a luxury that she's given up, and she continues to resent that. I gave up smoking, and I don't have that cigarette-shaped hole. I don't know why. But nevertheless, I don't think my wife is going, when I go home tomorrow, I'm going to find her smoking. It's just that something in her, possibly in her brain. I mean, again, don't get me started on brainism. You hear sometimes in conferences that brains decide things, or that this bit of your brain makes this. Brains don't decide, people decide. A person is an emergent process, transcendent from brains, and you know, the idea that bits. Your brain no more makes a decision than your thermostat makes a decision it's time to turn the heating on. You know, clearly we all depend on our neural substrate, but the point of being human is to transcend that. We are a social, cultural animal, and we exist in a cultural, social context. And the idea of trying to reduce that to brain function is just absurd, philosophically incoherent for one thing. But I think there's a tendency to kind of explain, yes?
So now thank you. You have identified some factors that you consider are essential to the effectiveness of a treatment program. So imagine the next step would be to set up a treatment program that has those elements, and then you go back to the same, now let's find out whether this works or not.
Yes. It would be, I mean, this is a tiny, tiny dip in the, you know, PhD thesis just does a little drop of knowledge, and you're quite right. You know, we need to test this out. Is this what's really going on in all treatment programs? I doubt it. But if you wanted to set up a treatment program that was effective with a broad range of people, the next thing to do is I'd like to go and see if this works in Zimbabwe, or I'd like to see if it works with, you know, a women's program, or I'd like to see if it works the same way, and see if this is. I doubt very much whether you're going to find something completely universal. But exactly, I mean, it's the whole point of. Is this something that is just limited to this treatment setting, or is it something that's generalizable?
I was encouraging you to go back to the introduction that you gave us. You'd go back to the same paradigm then.
To the
same paradigm now, to then ask in an evidence-based manner whether these treatment interventions.
Yes, I mean, a realist would never say that you shouldn't empirically test your ideas, and of course you would want to, but you're not going to see, I mean, for example, reducing class sizes is a randomized controlled trial intervention into schools, and in Tennessee they did that, and the SAT scores rose. So people began to think, oh, well, that's what you need to do. Look, here it is, a randomized controlled trial. It shows you that if you put the kids into smaller classes, then their scores rise. They transferred that to another state, I think it was California, and the SAT scores fell, plummeted. So what was going on was that the context was different. The Californian system didn't have the resources to manage the smaller classes. They didn't have enough staff. They didn't have the environment that was needed. So paradoxically, something that had been experimentally shown to work in one place didn't work in another. So one has to ask, what form does this need to take in different cultures, in different places? And yes, some kind of testing of that would be useful. I mean, what this study does not show is what the outcomes of the treatment were in terms of sobriety. I mean, in fact, they're pretty good. I've followed them up, but this study doesn't say anything about that. So yeah, you do return to a kind of empirical testing of your ideas, for sure. John?
Hi Tim, thank you so much. I don't know, just to give you a little compliment, how fortunate we are in the field to have you in your capacity as a trainer and leading research like this. I think we forget about that, and that's my personal opinion. So thank you. We've had discussions in the past about effectiveness of counsellors in group situations.
Yeah.
The power of the group and the individual counsellor. What could you say about that? As you said here, there has to be more of a focus on group dynamics and group training and group facilitation. A lot of courses don't include group work training, as you said.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about that? And again, if you like, what is the effectiveness of a counsellor, the counselling role in treatment these days, in your opinion, or from what you've seen? That makes sense.
I mean, it makes perfect sense, and thank you for that question. I don't know how to make an easy answer. I think what you want is people who have a profound humanity, first of all, who are going to put their ability to relate and care for the people that are in the treatment first. Because you can't get too abstract. You can't learn how to relate systemically by doing a systemic training. You have to do the systemic training and combine it with your humanity. You have to it can't get too abstract, in other words. I want people who can think relationally. I mean, I think Western society is far too individualist. It tends to think in terms of, human beings being kind of fleshy computers looking out at the world and appraising it, whereas I believe identity and emotion is profoundly social. And human beings don't make any sense except in relationship to other human beings. So I think the ability to think relationally and not to think people have got something in their head that's called addiction. I mean, I think this medical kind of diagnosis and intervention model is wrong for addiction, and we should be thinking about recovery management, about thinking of it in a much more social way. And I would choose people who are talented and humane and chuck the other lot out. Yes, Susie, I'll come to you, Dominic, in a second.
Yes, you were talking about, thank you, Tim, for everything you said, that was fantastic, about reflexivity, which is, for me, who I've worked with people who are quite damaged for a very long time, for longer periods, and that is something that can be quite complicated for certain people too. Can you say a little bit?
Yes, I mean, very,
how you
very
would
interesting.
promote that?
The literature suggests that addicts are alexithymic, that they have no access to their reflexivity and so on. These people are in the first few weeks of recovery, and they are the most articulate, rich. None of them are educated. None of these people had, well, one or two of them probably had degrees, but most didn't. Most had left school early, and yet the articulacy and the richness and the perceptiveness of what they had to say, including about themselves, was very remarkable. You look at there's a thesis I had a look at which says, people who are addict can't think about themselves. Well, it's not true. It depends on the context. And I think this program is a kind of training in reflexivity. I think in the few weeks people learn how to think about themselves. The relationships that they're invited into develop that reflexivity, and these people.
That's facilitation that enables that.
Yes.
That's not a natural. That's not just a given.
It's not. I mean, other than in a way, we all need. The idea that there is such a thing as a non-reflexive person again doesn't make too much sense. Robert West is interesting because he says, look, low self-esteem reduces reflexivity, because if you hate yourself, you don't really want to think about yourself. It's aversive. So in other words, people will avoid self-reflection because they don't like what they feel about it. But in a certain kind of environment, he suddenly comes alive. I mean, these people are not, they're not academics, they're not intellectuals, but they are phenomenally articulate, and they were across the board, both in Bournemouth, Liverpool and Essex. And they'd come out of severe dependence. You don't end up in a structured abstinence treatment program unless you've got quite a serious problem. They didn't have, on the whole, massively complicating mental health problems, and that might make a difference. And I've worked quite a lot with various types of psychosis, and I do agree that reflexivity and psychosis are difficult, complicated mixtures. But on the whole, I think people who come into treatment programs can suddenly blossom in terms of their reflexivity under certain contexts, and that we should really encourage that and assume that people can do it. I mean, I think again, if you treat people as though they're not going to be able to be reflexive, well, they're not going to be able to be reflexive. But if you think, actually, this person can tell me about themselves and can think about how they're reflecting, they could all do it. And in fact, they were doing it from day one. I mean, there were a couple of people who said, I couldn't stand, when I came in here, it was so intense, I didn't know what was going on. It was so emotionally intense, and I really wanted to leave. But I went home on the weekend, and I had a real think about it. I'm going to go to Dominic and then to you, if that's okay. So you've been wanting.
Yes, having looked at a lot of patient satisfaction forms when they're leaving treatment, I think that safety, caring and structure are, for me, the three biggest standouts from the feedback we get.
Yeah.
People are very quick to point out when such and such an activity was cancelled and that bothers them. And structure seems, structure is really important. I was wondering whether the counsellors you interviewed also identified structure in the same way that the patients did, and they saw the importance of it the same way. And I'm also just wondering about the importance of structure in an outpatient program versus a residential program, whether that's any different. Because of course, a lot of people think they're going to rehab to get away from it, relax, put up their feet, and so on. I was just interested in that question of structure, really.
I mean, I did ask people, look, you feel safe here, well, will you go home at 5 o'clock, how do you feel safe in the evening? And people said stuff like, well, I'm so knackered, I just go to bed. I mean, that was one of the things. Or they were going to a meeting with somebody, or they were going to go to the brink and hang out with people in the program anyway. What was brilliant about it was that people were transferring immediately the knowledge that the new things they were learning into their home environments, and that seemed to be very useful. I think a perfect environment is not a good idea. I mean, as Winnicott suggested, our consciousness is formed when we get let down. So the occasional Castle Craig failure to put on an advertised activity could actually be quite good for people, in the sense that it kind of makes me think, does this ruin the whole thing, or can I deal with it? So not being completely perfect is a good idea, and being transparent about it. And I think if people, if somehow you can't hold an activity, explain to the patient group the reason, and generally people will understand it. I sometimes taken to think to be thinking that I'm against that residential treatment is a thing of the past and we don't need it anymore. I don't think that at all. But I do think that day programs are the 21st century rehab. That essentially that will become the dominant model in the way that the house on the hill was the dominant model from the 60s to the 2000s. There will always be a need for residential treatment. There will all be, and as we see here, it's also a luxury product. You can have orchids on your table and a bespoke menu in Thailand if you wish to get your recovery. But that is clearly a luxury product. And some people want luxury. I've just bought myself a luxury car, which I don't need, but I want to have it, and it's giving me a certain amount of temporary pleasure before it all pulls. And I realise that. But there will always. I mean, I think residential rehab is splitting into luxury product and a kind of need to accommodate very complex needs, neither of which is ideal. There are some flagship residential places around, including Castle Craig, I would say, even though I still come and visit it. But for me, recovery in the community is the thing that's going to bring recovery to more people. The way that this program is also effective is that you're right in the community of recovery that you're going to be joining. So you're meeting people are coming in as volunteers. They're the people who left 6 weeks ago are now doing their mentoring training. They come back and visit. They bring people in. So there's a connection between the treatment program and the recovering community. And now, of course, that restricts it a bit to conurbations at the moment. Although not in Essex. I mean, Ben Hughes, the commissioner in Essex, is bussing and taxiing people from all over the county to Braintree to do this day programme. He's found the money to do it because he believes in this programme. So for me, day programmes can handle the same demographic. I mean, the people are not different who come to Sharp as come to Clouds. They've got exactly the same range of problems, and they seem, on the whole, to handle it. If somebody can't handle it, then off to residential. But other than that, I think day programmes are going to be the future because they're cheaper. They're not much cheaper because to do it properly you still need a lot of resource. And certainly in the statutory sector, people are disinvesting from a residential treatment.
Were you surprised to find structured as a theme in so much?
Structure?
Yeah, structure.
Sorry, say again?
Were you surprised to find structure as a feedback from so many people in terms of what was really important for them?
Well, I found it personally surprising, as I'm a deeply chaotic person. But no, I don't. I think it's really important. I don't. Transitioning into recovery is a scary, very deeply anxiety-provoking state, and providing people with something predictable, warm, welcoming, understandable, transparent, really, really, really helps. And practically everybody loved it. They particularly liked the fact that we did random drug testing, for example, because it made them feel safe. They particularly liked the induction week, which explained the programme, what it's going to be like. They loved that. They loved the fact that, oh God, I can get here. I've been told to get here at 8:30 and here I am. It was simply that. I mean, one of Martin, the guy who, it's a pseudonym, said, my life didn't have any structure in it. I've come here and I'm really responding to this structure. And I said, well, do you find it easy to respond to it? He said, yeah, it's crystal clear. It's really predictable, and virtually everybody that I interviewed said something like that. So yeah, and even if you're kicking against it, it's something to kick against, isn't it? I mean, if there's no structure. So I think that if you provide a program, it's got to have a structure, it's got to have that warmth and acceptance, and it's got to challenge people. It's got to go beyond their comfort zone to an extent which they can handle. 10 more minutes. Yes, sorry, yes, you've been asking.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering whether the assumption is that addicts don't like structure. I wonder if that's our personal bias. Because I think in treatment centers, we tend to carry a bias about the addict population that we're working with. And there's almost a sense that we have to contain them behaviorally or pharmacologically. But to your point about the brain and the medical model, I mean, I think that we no longer see the patient as a collaborator in care. We tend to have this sort of, we know better than you, we know what the stages of change are, the stages of recovery are, and we pay lip service to client-centered care, but we don't really practice it, in the sense that, induction, orientation, having patients understand what the milestones in treatment are for success, and truly engaging in a collaborative process so that the patient actually understands what they're there to do. And it's interesting because, if you have a long time to treat them, 2 weeks is fine as to sort of, kind of get the feel of the place. But in the States, usually it's about 30 days, so we can't really afford to have them spend 2 weeks just kind of learning how to trust. So that orientation and induction is absolutely essential. But I think a lot of it has to do with organizational culture. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more about the fact that we relied so much on brain chemistry and the sort of brain, the drugs that we actually don't, we give psychoeducation, we no longer do real therapy. And group therapy, I've seen many therapists do, individual therapy in a group setting, but not actual group therapy.
Quite, I mean, you make
the training is appalling these days.
I mean, you make a number of extremely cogent points. I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying, and collaborative work is very difficult, particularly when people are very vulnerable. You have to set up a structure for them. You have to have some expertise where you're ahead of the curve as far as they are concerned, but inviting them into it, and Rudy Moose, who was working at the VA in Palo Alto, somewhere around Stanford, was saying in the 50s and 60s that organizational culture and the environment that you provide for people in psychiatric situations is crucial to people. In the places where he was seeing people getting better had exactly the characteristics that I found out from here. So yeah, and training people in how to facilitate a group and not to do one-to-one, and it's critical stuff. And tomorrow I want to talk about what I can, again, this sounds like a criticism, but to be honest, the standards generally in treatment in the States and here are quite deplorable, and there's quite a lot of evidence that they are deplorable. So come on.
One of the things that we all pay attention to outcomes after the fact, and we're working on actually instituting outcomes during the course of treatment, so the patient learns advocacy or agency,
Yeah.
so that they can speak to everything they're now happy with, because it's actually the unhappy patients are the ones who are acting out,
Mhm.
the most honest patients, because otherwise you have a lot of treatment failure because we give ourselves a pat on the back when the patient sort of completes treatment, but most of them are sort of fairly compliant. And so then you have multiple treatment episodes. And so the more agency a patient has and the more they're able to disagree, and the agency is able to kind of turn around and constantly look at what is it that we're doing, how well are we doing,
Yeah.
and what's the feedback that we're getting once we're doing it. That's organizational culture.
Yeah.
And we ask our patients to take their own inventory all the time, and as an agency we never do that. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never worked in an agency that's actually willing to look at its own organizational culture and saying, what is it that we're doing? How good are we at this? And are we really looking to, it's like Miles was talking about earlier, are we willing to take on these kind of difficult conversations with our consumers?
Yeah, and I mean, I completely 100% agree with that. And that is the way to improve, is by examining ourselves in that way. And yeah, you're right. I mean, this is not about patients passively submitting themselves to a process. It's actively participating in it and changing it as a result. I mean, patients change the way that Sharp works because of their, they will disagree with something, or they will, and they'll negotiate. And yeah, okay, well, there's a power differential between us and them, but nevertheless we try and equal that up. Yeah, thanks very much for your comments.
Yeah, that was kind of going some way towards kind of answering my question. Totally on board with the day rehab, as I like to call it. I'm very passionate about creating more of that space in the community. And certainly here the key principles of safe, caring, structure. But like you've already alluded to, we're only, at the moment, it's only reaching a very, very small percentage, and there's a massive cohort there which is finding it really difficult to even get towards access of that. Have you got any insights and certainly in your experience of delivering day rehab so far?
I mean, it's that, again, really interesting point. It's not in the book yet. If you look for a book on rehab, it's a residential thing. It's assumed that it's the house on the hill, or the hospital, or whatever. Of course, there have been day programs for 50 years, probably. And then again, they've done all kinds of versions in the States, evening programs for people still at work, all kinds of variations. But on the whole, it's not in the consciousness of people who are commissioning treatment. And I think I think day programs have the potential. There was a phenomenon in the States that's not known about. Bill White writes about it in Slaying the Dragon, which was that managed care came in, and a number of other things happened in the early 90s, and there was a collapse in the alcoholism treatment industry. Massive, drastic. Hospital chains collapsed that were providing treatment. And it was because they were asked to account for their outcomes, and they couldn't. Now, they found that there was some research coming out that day programs were as effective as residential for that population. But of course, people who had a business model in flying people in from various parts of the States to a residential centre suddenly found their business collapsing, because they had to then, with a day program, which was what was being commissioned, there's only people in the local vicinity that can advantage. You have to be able to get there. Well, my vision is that we get lots and lots and lots of good quality day rehab in this product, so that every conurbation in this country has at least one really high quality Sharp, or this is our model, but there could be others, and that gradually it becomes known and people realise. I mean, there was another evaluator of our Sharp program, did a qualitative evaluation, and this guy who went, he talked to him and he said, I thought I was being fobbed off with a day program. I thought they were just trying to save money, they didn't want to run a hotel. But now it makes perfect sense. In other words, having been through the program, you could see how the combination of being at home, being in the recovering community, being in treatment, how that combined to make a very powerful treatment experience. And he was totally converted. And I think that's the process that people are not, oh, you need residential, this person can't possibly manage day pro. They can. If it's properly implemented, but of course you can't run a business model then where you're taking people from all over the place and putting them into a residential and keeping them there for several weeks. I mean, that clearly you need to keep that on a residential basis. So I think it is, in 20 years' time, day programs will be the norm, I think, in addiction, and properly structured, properly implemented.
That's part of why they're renamed, because we did the same thing, because again, people did feel like they thought, look, there were residential rehab and we were delivering an intensive abstinence program in the community. But as soon as we named it day rehab and made sure then there was links with the rehab as well,
Yeah.
People didn't feel fobbed off and they're engaging. But I thought the challenge we've got now in this area is that the area I'm talking about is that there's a massive cohort of people who are still struggling to get,
Yeah.
still on substitute meds. How do we get them into this day?
I mean, accessibility is a general problem, whether you're talking about residential or day. I mean, we still run residential service, so it's not like Action and Addiction doesn't have residential. We've got Clouds House, and we're intending to keep it going. It's not that we don't think residential has a place, but in a sense, I think you can get to much more people by getting them to understand that rehab, real proper rehab, can be done on a day basis, and that it's just as intensive and demanding as residential, and in some ways has some advantages. Again, Bill White's very good on that. I think he's a really worthy guru of the field. Writes like crazy, puts it all on the net for us all to read, and he's a very good historian. He's a clever guy, and he's beginning to suggest that treatment in the recovering community is more powerful than treatment in a different environment and then returning. I mean, it's not a simple argument. Sometimes that's exactly what people need. Anyway, it's kind of 5:30, and it could be time to conclude and go off and have a cigarette or whatever you want to do. So